everyone. Thanks for being here. We are pleased today with the E3C Hub to receive Javad Nasiry, who is a professor in operation management at Desautels.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Olivia, for the invitation, and thanks, Micah, for all the arrangements that you made to make the system work. I'm going to stay on this side of the room today, the paper side. I usually like to walk around, but so it's a great opportunity for me to present some of my work to E3C Club and get to know folks and hopefully develop collaborations down the road related to the topic that I have in mind for today, and that is analytical models in agricultural supply chains. So I have chosen two pieces rather than one piece presenting one over that we have. And the main reason behind that is I want to present high-level ideas, how we thought about these problems, rather than going into the nitty-gritty of proofs and propositions and the mathematical details. Of course, one of those papers that I'm presenting, the first one is already published in Mathematical Science, so it's available online. The second one on food waste is under major revision, and I'm happy to share work in progress if you're interested in the details. And we have one over, it's a small group, so feel free to stop me anytime you want and ask any questions that you may like. I'm very happy to handle questions as we go along the presentation. So the first piece that I have chosen relates to the problem in the upstream agricultural supply chain. So you can imagine many different problems in different stages of an agricultural supply chain. And I have chosen one that relates to upstream agricultural supply chains, the decision on what crops to plant on a piece of farmland. And the second part is going to focus on more downstream problems in the agricultural supply chain and the problem of food waste with the suppliers, retailers, and the final consumer households.
I would just recommend to put the where this.
Yeah,
I
sure,
think the sound is not.
Of course. It's okay. See. Is it better now? Okay, great, good. Now, so the first piece will focus on dynamic farm space allocation under uncertainty and crop rotation benefits. This is a joint work with two of my colleagues at Singapore Management University, Onur Boyabatli and Helen Zhu. So what is the problem that we are focusing on in this first paper? So imagine a farmer that every year has to make decisions on which crops to plant on a piece of land that he or she owns, and also what fraction of the land available to dedicate to each and every crop that he or she plans to plant on the farm. So this is a key decision that affects the profitability of a farmer. So depending on what the farmer plants on that piece of land and what sort of allocation is made between the different crops that they plant, then there will be revenues realized at the end of the planting season, the harvest season. So that's going to be a key decision affecting the profitability, and we want to address one of those problems. So we are taking the choice of the crops to plant given because there are different combinations of plants that a farmer can plant. We will see down the road that this choice is not random, so the crops are not independent from each other. It's not that you can decide to plant any crop that you want. They have joint benefits. We call them crop rotation benefits that you do want to take advantage. So crops go hand in hand. And then after you have chosen which crops to plant, you will have to make a decision on what fraction of the farmland to dedicate to each of those crops. So for us, The decision, the problem is the second one. So let's assume that a farmer has made a decision to plant corn and soybean, and we will see they have strong joint benefits when they go together. And the question would be, if we have already made a decision to plant corn and soybean, what fraction of the land is supposed to be dedicated to each one of these two crops? Now, there are two things that are going to affect the decision significantly. One is the uncertainty, and the other one is the crop rotation benefits. Now, what do I mean by uncertainty? Uncertainty, the way we model it, is going to come from two sources. One of them is price uncertainty. When the decision is made on what fraction of the land to dedicate to each one of the two crops, the farmer doesn't know what the price will be in the spot market to sell the crop, the harvest. So that's one aspect of the uncertainty. And the second one is farm yield uncertainty. So the yield is subject to a number of variables. Among them is the weather conditions. So for example, this year, we have had, in the past couple of years, we have had more humid weather than usual. And as you know, humidity affects the yield of coffee crop. So the yield is going to go down because of excessive humidity in the weather. This is outside the control of the farmer. The farmer cannot predict it. It's just something that unravels during the season. Or you could be also imagining pest attacks or diseases and so on and so forth that may affect the yield. It's not only the quantity that may vary when we have these conditions, but also the quality of the crop gets affected with these conditions. So this means that at the end of the season, you don't necessarily know. When you make the decision on what fraction of the land to dedicate to each one of the crops, you don't know what the yield at the end of the season would be. Yield amounting to the quantity and quality of the crop that you harvest. And of course, the way we imagine, revenue is a multiplication of yield and price. Price is uncertain, and also yield is uncertain. The multiplication of these two uncertain variables is going to determine the revenue of the farmer per acre of the land that he or she farms on. So this is basically one aspect to keep in mind in our problem. And the second one is the crop rotation benefits. So crop rotation benefits in the sense that when certain crops go together, so crops are using nutrients from the soil, and usually if you choose the crops properly, like corn and soybean, what one crop takes away from the soil, the other one tends to return to the soil. So for example, corn is known to be nitrogen hungry. So it likes to take away the nitrogen content of the soil, but then soybean is known to replenish that nutrient within the soil. So if you're rotating these two crops, you can imagine that the yield is going to go up. So if you plant corn where you had soybean last year, you can imagine that the yield is going to be higher this year for the corn crop, and the other way around. So this is basically what we mean by yield enhancing benefits. Of course, there are other benefits that come with it. You can also imagine that the pest cycles break. When we plant corn or soybean or any crop in one part of the land, then pests tend to thrive there, and then they will survive for the coming harvest periods as well. But if you change the crop that you have put on the land, then that cycle breaks down as well. So you have multiple benefits that come from crop rotation. Well, that's not the only benefit though. We also have farming cost reduction because of rotation, in the sense that you don't need to use as much pesticides or other fertilizers in order to grow the same crop. As I mentioned, well, we have the break-in pest cycles and other things, and that means that you can usually save on the costs of farming as well. So the way we think about this is that you will be getting a boost, as I will show a bit later. You will get a boost in terms of the yield if you are rotating, and you will get a discount in terms of the costs of farming when you are rotating the crops on the land. Now, in this context, what is it that we are trying to do? what we are trying to do is, first of all, to model the problem and identify the optimal policy for the farmer. So what fraction of the land is supposed to be dedicated to each one of the crops with the intention of maximizing the farmer's profitability at the end of the season? That's what we want to do, to identify the optimal policy for the farmer. And the second one would be to calibrate this model using real data, which is coming from USDA, US Department of Agriculture, and then test the performance of multiple policies against the optimal policy. Well, the optimal policy from a stochastic dynamic program is understandably complex, and we should not be expecting that it's going to be implemented in practice. And in practice, farmers use a range of heuristics. It could be, for example, always rotate, or monoculture farming, which means always plant one type of crop, and so on and so forth. And we want to see the performance of these heuristics versus the optimal policy, and also come up, hopefully, with a heuristic based on the optimal policy that can do better than these mostly applied heuristics in practice. So these are the goals that we had in this research. Now, with this little introduction, well, I'm not going to go into the details of the literature. That's not the purpose of the talk for today. But we are contributing to, very briefly, overall speaking, we are contributing to two streams of literature. One of them is agricultural economics. So there has been a lot of work on these two problems: which crops to plant, the combination of the crops to plant, and how to allocate the land. But usually in agricultural economics, the focus is on developing realistic stochastic DPs and then calibrating them with the data in order to analyze the impact of policy and so on and so forth. They usually do not focus on characterizing the optimal policy and then basing new proposed heuristics based on their performance in comparison with the optimal policy. So that's basically what we try to contribute, given that in operations, we tend to be good in spending our time with mathematical formulas. Now, that's basically one stream, but then the other one, perhaps more related to the OM/OR community, is this burst of research that we have had maybe since early 2000s on agricultural supply chains. So there is, in every step of the line that you will see in the supply chain, there has been research that is popping up, investigating very interesting problems. And I'm not going to go into the details of these papers, it's not the purpose, but you can find very interesting papers dealing with the production stage of agriculture, inventory management with the processors, or you could be looking at upstream supply chain, seed planning, and so on and so forth. So this is a very promising area of research, and as I mentioned, we see a lot of research being done, and I believe OM/OR tools can be applied in a wide variety of problems in this supply chain. So I'm presenting two of those today, but there are a lot of interesting things that one can work on. So now, in terms of the model, so what sort of details do I have in the model? So again, a brief highlight of the model and not necessarily the exact details. So imagine that we have a farmland normalized to 1, and in a period T out of a finite horizon, in each period, we will have the following decisions being made. So the key decision that the farmer is making is what fraction of the farmland to allocate to corn, which means the complement of it, 1 minus alpha T, is going to be dedicated to soybean. So we are focusing only on corn and soybean, not because the model is limited to this, but because down the road we will be using the data on corn and soybean from Iowa to actually calibrate the model. That's why we are focusing on framing the model as corn versus soybean. But of course, it can be extended to more than 2 crops, and the decision is certainly remain the same. As we mentioned, the uncertainty comes from 2 sources, and it gets reflected on the revenue per acre. So revenue per acre is uncertain given the uncertainty in prices and the yield of each of these crops. So we have a unit farming cost. So if you are planting corn, it's going to be FC. If you are planting soybean, it's going to be FS. But in case you are rotating the crops, then this farming cost is going to get a discount. So planting on a piece of land, planting corn on a piece of land where you had soybean, is going to give you a boost in terms of the yield, which we call the B parameter in there. And it's going to give you a discount as well, which we call the gamma factor in terms of the farming costs. And likewise, it also applies to the soybean as well. So this is basically the key ingredients that we have in the model. And in terms of sequence of the events, well, the farmer at the beginning of the period knows the history of the revenue. So we are assuming a Markovian revenue process, but very briefly, it simply means that the farmer knows what has happened in terms of revenues in the past, and the farmer recalls what fraction of the land was dedicated to different crops in the past. So we know the history of the farming as well. So that history in here is going to be only 1 year, because corn and soybean are known to have 1 year soil memory. But we do have crop combinations that have more than 1 year memory, which means what you did 2 years before may affect the yield in 2 years down the road. So this is basically what we call more than 1 year memory. So corn and soybean are usually with 1 year. So that means we only focus on the revenues that you got in the previous period and also what you planted on the farm in the year before, not basically 2 years or 3 years. Again, the model is not limited. I have chosen to present this one, but our paper can be easily extended to more than 1 year soil memory as well. So given this and the allocations that the farmer has had in the past, the decision will be what fraction to allocate to corn, and of course the complement of it, 1 minus alpha t, is going to be dedicated to soybean. So at the end of the period, we have the revenues realizing, and of course, given the yield realization as well, the farmer is going to get the profit that he or she was hoping for. So this is basically the structure of the model that we have. So to explain basically how the rotation is going to come to this picture, maybe it's going to be helpful to show the dynamics in this little graph in here. So imagine I have a strip of land, and in one particular year, I have alpha equal to 30%. So 30% is corn, and the remainder, 70%, is allocated to soybean in a particular year. Now, in the year after, imagine that I switch to alpha equal to 80%. So I put 80% corn and the remainder 20% soybean. So what's going to happen in this case? Well, we can see that I am putting the soybean where I had corn the year before. That means I am planting on rotated land for soybean. And likewise for corn, part of the corn is being farmed or planted where I had soybean before. So you will have the rotation benefits in here, and there is this piece of land where you had corn in the year before, and you keep planting corn again, which means you won't be getting the crop rotation benefits for that particular piece of land. So we have to keep track of these in the model and figure out what the optimal policy would be for the farmer. So again, so I'm not interested in the details, but we can write down the immediate payoff for the farmer in terms of the farming costs and the expected revenues that will come to the farmer if a unit of land is allocated to either soybeans or corn. So we have two options, and we essentially look at which option is going to give us the highest expected profit. Expected profit means what you get now and also what accumulates over time in a dynamic setting. So this is basically the short-term profit. I can add this to my dynamic program and get the Bellman equation that we are very familiar with. Now, again, the details don't matter. So the key observation that we have in solving this model is that we can prove there is a recursive operator that represents the marginal revenue of farm space in period T, where crop J was grown in period T minus 1. So what I mean is the following. So this K parameter, this K operator, is going to have the history of the revenues in there. So that's a T minus RT minus 1. And C is the history, the 1 year history that comes with it. So we have KC RT minus 1. So we have the revenues in the past period. And we also have the history, which is corn in this particular case. Now, I have two options. I can either put corn or I can put soybean. If I put corn, I'm not going to get the benefits of rotation. So you can see in there RT minus FC will be the revenues that I will have in this current period, and then I will have the future periods as well. It's going to be KC RT again, showing up as the operator. Or I can decide to rotate, which means I will get the benefits of the boost in the revenue and also discount in the farming costs. And then I'm going to take the operator to the next year, which means I will have soy on where I had corn before. And we can do the same analysis with the soybean as well. So the existence of this operator, recursive operator, simplifies the problem that we have in here quite a lot. And it helps us to identify the structure of the optimal policy. So this usually doesn't happen in stochastic dynamic programs, but the way we set up the model shows that this operator exists, and based on the existence of it, we can actually show that the optimal policy will be a combination of monoculture farming and rotation. So at some point, you are going to hit either monoculture soybean plantation or monoculture corn plantation in the model, or you will keep rotating. So put corn where you had soybean and put soybean where you had corn. So this is basically what happens in the optimal policy. Now, we don't need to get into the details of the model, but the idea is that the optimal policy is going to be a combination of these two policies, monoculture and always rotate. So with that optimal policy, now I can move ahead with calibrating the model. The details, again, I'm not going to cover, but to model it, we are using a bivariate mean reverting revenue process with the parameters that we have introduced in the model. And I'm going to be using the data from USDA in order to get the price data for corn and soybean and also the yield data. So based on those data, I can build the revenue in the data set and then move ahead with calibrating the model and identifying the optimal policy. Now, so in terms of the key insights that we get when we calibrate the model, what we observed is the following. So indeed, the more correlation we have between the revenues of corn and soybean, the option value indeed decreases in having the choice to put corn or soybean on the land. So the higher the correlation, well, from the portfolio theory, we know that the profit of the farmer is going to go down. This is also what we observe in the data. Now, when it comes to the volatility of the revenues with one crop, the results are a little bit more interesting in the following sense. So when you have two crops, so you are trying to choose one crop that is going to give you the highest profit. So you have two options, and the intention is to choose the one that is going to give me the highest profit for that piece of land I own, a unit of land that I own. Now, so if you have, if the volatility, let's say in the revenues of one crop is already low, below a threshold, then a little bit of increase in the volatility is going to increase the revenue, of course. But let's not forget we have two crops and there is correlation between these two. So the covariance effect is going to dominate the variability effect, and we will actually see that the revenue of the farmer, the profit of the farmer actually goes down. That's why you see this convex pattern in our data. And then, but in case the volatility is already high, above a threshold, increasing the volatility even more is going to lead to a situation where you will get the benefits. So the variability impact is going to dominate the covariance impact, and you will see the farmer's profit going up. So a little bit of variability, in case it's low, it's not going to help. But in case the variability is already high, then having more of it can actually increase the option value. And this is, again, what we see in the data. So this is the interesting thing that we are observing in the data. So this is not the artifact of the model. The model actually predicts this will happen, and we see it clearly happening with corn. Interestingly, we don't see it when it comes to soybean, right? When we calibrate the data. And this simply means that we are already in a domain of that problem where we have volatility above a threshold, and having more of it actually helps the farmer. This is basically how to interpret this particular graph in here. So volatility's impact on the farmer's revenue depends really on how much volatility was there before and how much we are adding to it given the correlation that we have between the revenues of soy and corn, soybean and corn. So with that, now let me just move on to the heuristics that farmers are using in practice. So what we observed in different outlets is that farmers are using usually one of these heuristics. So we always have rotate, which means you are kind of starting with a allocation and you keep rotating between corn and soybean. So 20%, 80%, next year 80%, 20%, then 20%, 80%, and so on and so forth. That's what we mean by always rotate. Very commonly used in practice. Or we have always rotate, but monoculture. So one year you have entirely corn, the other one you have soybean. The next year you have corn again, and so on and so forth. So you're rotating, but it's monoculture. That's also often applied. Another one, very intuitive, is half-half. A farmer has a piece of land and they simply go with half-half. So corn and soybean half-half allocated, and they simply just carry through rotating over time. So, and then we have industrial practices, which is monoculture without rotation. So you always put corn on a piece of land and you continue over the years. So you can already imagine the heavy use of pesticides, fertilizers, and so on and so forth, because the yield is going to inevitably go down over the years. If you are planting corn, you cannot expect that 5 years down the road you will have the same as you had, let's say, at the beginning of the time. So that means you will have to replenish the nutrients using fertilizers, pesticides to fight off the pests. To break the cycle of the pests, you have to do a lot of different things on the farm. Well, besides the risks that this brings to the quality of the food that you're harvesting, this also brings down, increases the costs and a lot of other issues that it creates. And we will see in the table in a minute, that this actually has the lowest profit among all the other policies that we investigate in the paper. And this is coming from the actual data that we get. So I believe that data calibration helps to put this in perspective, that this is going to get us very far from the optimal policy. And then we have the myopic policy, which means, well, I'm aware of the crop rotation benefits. I know of all these uncertainties, but I'm not going to take a look into the future. I'm just going to do whatever is best in this current period for my profit. So no account for the future. So let me just pass on these. Now, the one that we are proposing based on our optimal policy is that we don't need to take into account the entire horizon, let's say 10 years, 20 years, or whatever we may have in mind as a farmer for a piece of land. How about only one period look ahead policy? So whenever I'm starting to plan, I'm only going to consider this year and the year after. That's it. So a 1 year, a 1 period look ahead policy. So this turns out to be a very simple policy within the framework of our model. We can actually specify the optimal policy explicitly in closed form. We can tell exactly what's happening in there. It seems to be simple enough. And what I will show in the table is that the performance of this one period look ahead policy is also very, very close to the performance of the optimal policy itself. Now, these are the results that we have from our data calibration. So what do we see in here? The key insights in here are that when you have monoculture without rotation, you are getting the worst performance, the most distance from the optimal policy with this monoculture without rotation. So on average, you can see that you are away 23.1% of the time, 1% from the optimal revenue that you can generate for the farmer. So this is the worst among all the policies that we studied. Now, if we take a look at the myopic versus the 1 period look ahead, we see that 1 period look ahead policy performs better than the myopic policy, which is perhaps expected because the myopic doesn't consider the future at all, but 1 period look ahead considers 1 period more. So that's not perhaps that surprising. What is interesting, well, before I go there. So when it comes to this, all of these instances that we have, always rotate performs better than always rotate with monoculture and always rotate half-half. So maybe that also makes sense given the benefits of the crop rotation. But the most interesting thing in here is that our policy, the 1 period look ahead, seems to be doing really, really good in terms of being close to the optimal policy. In all the instances, what we have is that we are 0.04% on average away from the optimal policy in terms of the revenues generated for the farmer. So the benefit of this is the ease of implementation. You can easily explain what this policy is. You can justify why it is good for the farmer because it comes really close to the optimal revenues that the farmer can make. And we believe it is better than other policies that currently are being used in practice. So these are basically the key findings that we had in this paper. So we characterize the farmer's optimal policy, dynamic allocation policy, and then by calibrating it with real data, we can show how different parameters, including the volatility of revenues and correlation between the revenues of the two crops can affect the farmer's revenues. And then we propose a heuristic that tends to do really well given the data that we got from USDA. So this is the key findings that we had in this paper. Now, I'm going to move to the second one, but before I do so, in case there are any questions, I'm very happy to take on this paper. Please.
Thanks a lot for the presentation.
No problem.
It's really interesting and also really nice the conclusions you have arrived to, and very well organized. And
Much
very well
appreciated.
explained. Thanks. I have a question about, so if I understand correctly, the monoculture without rotation scenario considers that when I do monoculture without rotation, there is like a discount if I choose the same crop.
That's right.
Yes.
So yeah, so what happens is that in terms of the yield, basically you're going to go down over the years because the yield is going to, nutrients are not replenished and the farming cost is going to also increase as well because you have to use more fertilizers, pesticides, and so on and so forth.
But this assumption, I think it holds in practice as well from one year to the other because, as you say, you need more inputs.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't see, how do you implement this in the like the standard model? Because I saw that there is a benefit for rotating,
mm-hmm.
that is changing from one crop to the other, but there is not a, well, in the first slides, there was not a discount for choosing the same crop.
That's right, that's right. So in case I want to incorporate that particular aspect, then I will have to kind of, over the years, if you keep planting the same one, I will have to discount the yield that you will get and also the increase in the farming cost that you will also have. So what I have in the model is essentially when you compare it with the other crop, so you will have the yield boost together with basically the decrease in the farming cost. But when you keep planting the same crop, then you will also have this decrease in yield over the years and increase in the farming cost as well. So if I consider that one, then the performance of this always rotate without monoculture without rotation is going to be even worse than what I had in the table in here. It's a good pickup, and exactly that's what's going to happen in practice.
So does that policy, the one-time look-ahead policy, doesn't has a risk of falling into the monoculture without rotation, that it says, okay, if I look ahead one period and I say monoculture.
That's right. That's right. So at some point, let's say, for example, you have a certain year where the profit of the corn is exceptionally high for some reason. Let's say because of tariffs, because of certain pressures in the marketplace, and then you decide to plant the entire farm with corn. So that you can fall into the trap of that monoculture without rotation over the years if you're only doing 1 year look ahead. But the idea is this one is at least better than the other policies that are being used at the moment, because other policies are going to be subject to the same shocks as well, and it can lead to worse performance over time. That's the key idea in here. So it's at least better than the other ones, but of course it can fall into the trap of kind of monoculture over time as well.
So what is happening here is that, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So what is happening here is that because the monoculture without rotation doesn't update the beliefs on the other external conditions, then it's falling it's not performing better than the proposed. Than
the other ones, exactly. Because it just fails to consider any rotation benefits, any kind of farming cost benefits over time in case you are rotating and so on and so forth. And if I add the point that you mentioned at the beginning, that the yield is going to go down also over time, so I have to discount the yield and also increase in the cost, then the performance is going to be really bad in comparison to others.
Maybe the yield doesn't go down, but you will need more inputs.
More inputs, yeah, that's right, in order to kind of keep up the soil nutrients and so on and so forth. Yeah,
That's all.
exactly.
Yeah, very nice. It
Absolutely.
clarified everything.
Sure. Please.
You're talking about the dynamic allocation, so that's where you can react to the uncertainty that was before. So in terms of price, there's kind of price pads. Like if I look at it more discrete, or is the price in each of the periods independent of the price that was realized in the previous period?
So very good question. So when we model this, we are looking at the uncertainty in the Markovian way. So we say one period, the history is going to be summarized in RT-1 when I'm at time t. But, and I believe when we calibrated the model, this was a good estimation to what we saw in, so the bivariate approach that we had seemed to be matching the data relatively well. But you're absolutely right. So maybe more than a year, maybe 2-3 years can be actually.
And I can see it in terms of price. And what about the yield?
Yield, yeah. I knew that question is going to come out.
Because
You're right. So let's say, so again, it's an assumption.
global warming, that there might be some.
Absolutely. So it could be, let's say, more than, so it's going to be important in the sense that some crops actually have more than 1 year soil memory. So that's one thing. So corn and soybean, we chose it because it has only 1 year soil memory. But even in that case, you could imagine that the impact could be more than a year. So our operator, the one that we invented out of luck perhaps, keeps only 1 year memory. So we are saying what you did with this piece of land the year before, it was corn or soybean, and what you can do this year, which is two options, either corn or soybean. But in case you kind of keep, let's say, more than 1 year memory for any reason in terms of yield, let's say 2 years, 3 years, or more perhaps, then I doubt the same operator is going to pop up in the optimal policy. It's going to be much more complicated than the one that we presented. But I haven't looked into that case in the paper. Very good question. Yes, please, Micah.
It's super interesting, and I was wondering if you've ever used a model for organic culture, like you're using soybean and corn.
That's right.
But like it would be even more useful for organic agriculture.
That's right. So I believe the reason that it came up when we were doing this paper a while back, and the reason that we did not focus on organic farming is because the fractions allocated to organic farming are actually very small. So so as part of my recent research actually shows into tomato supply chains actually in Quebec. Shows that organic tomato farmers usually do it out of following some regulations, trying to kind of address some limited demand in the market. So they are kind of vocal about organic farming not being profitable, given that you cannot basically keep up the yields. It's very expensive to defend against pests and so on and so forth. An interesting observation that we had was, so when you're kind of composting other things in the farm, you cannot use that compost in organic farming, by the way, because you can contaminate the yield, the organic product. That means usually the allocation to organic farming is tiny and not necessarily that profitable, which is the reason we did not discuss that in the paper. But you do have a point in there. So whether you can actually do it with organic farming is another question, because as I said, there could be contamination across the two products. But even if it's possible, the fractions are really tiny in practice. So we did not focus on that problem and the particular issues that come with it, definitely in organic farming. But it's a good consideration, absolutely. Good. So in the time that we have about 20 minutes. It's going to be more than enough. Olivier has seen that presentation before when I presented the paper at that Javad membership thing. But I'm going to be presenting kind of a high level of that paper as well. So you could see what kind of focus we had in that second paper as well. So this one, the second one, focuses on traceability and food waste in agricultural supply chain. So let's say we have all those efforts in the supply chain trying to help the farmers come up with the best yield possible, and get the most product possible into the market. But then we come down to the reality of how food actually is being consumed. And according to some sources in Canada, we have 60% of food actually being wasted, with 30% of that fraction actually edible when it's being tossed. So I'm going to explain very briefly what I mean by that food waste in agricultural supply chains, because it can mean different things. But I believe the problems are all up and down the supply chain of agricultural supply chains, and there is a lot of interesting things that we could do in there. So in terms of the overall picture, in the world, 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted every year. That's 20% of the production. The cost is, in 2022, the last time that I checked the numbers, is more than $1 trillion to the global economy. 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions, more than aviation, is because of food waste. And in Hong Kong, where I was based for a long time, 3,000 tons of food waste every day, given that Hong Kong is a culinary destination in the world. And this happens all the while 733 million people in the world live in hunger. So hunger is different from food poverty, by the way. So food poverty is when you get the calories that you want, but you don't get what you actually need in terms of nutrients. So that's food poverty. But hunger is when you don't have enough calories to eat in the first place. So this number refers to hunger in the numbers in 2023. So now, again, coming from the operations, the supply chain perspective. So as we mentioned, food waste can happen all over the supply chain. So what happens usually upstream the agricultural supply chain is what we refer to as food loss, not food waste. So food loss refers to the idea that part of the harvest, part of the yield is lost when the farmer is harvesting the crops, when it is being processed, and so on and so forth. I usually like to give a classic example from OR setting. So imagine that you have a piece of fabric, but the garment that you are trying to sew out of it is not basically a rectangle. It has a design, it has a shape, turns and curves and so on and so forth. So no matter how you cut this garment from this piece of fabric, you will have some waste left, some loss left. You can try, of course, to use OR methods to minimize that loss, but you will have that loss nonetheless. So that's what we refer to as food loss in the supply chain. It happens in the agricultural farms as well, let's say because of weather conditions or pest attacks and so on and so forth. The yields are lower, the quality could be lower, and so on and so forth. This is what we refer to as food loss. But more downstream to supply chain is what we have food waste. So this is food that is ready, edible for humans, but for different reasons, it gets tossed. It's not consumed by consumers. This can happen for a range of reasons. So if we look at, for example, the retail stage, it could be because of damaged products, because of packaging. It could be because of uneven temperatures when the food is being transported. As you know, when something is being transported along the supply chain, the more hands you are changing, the more oscillations you have in the temperature. The more oscillation you have in the temperature, the more waste, the more spoilage you will have in the food, and so on and so forth. Or it could be because of inventory planning. So you offer a certain level of discount to your consumers. They buy without having clear plans on how they are going to be using the food down the road in their household, and in the restaurants, for example. So they throw away food that is absolutely edible. So this is basically the overall picture that we have in the agricultural supply chain when it comes to food waste. And as I mentioned, the problem is actually very, very universal. So US pledged a while ago to cut the food waste by half until 2030. They are nowhere close to that target. Or Canada has, as I mentioned briefly before, a very serious problem with food loss and food waste. Food waste and loss amounts to about 60%. Out of that, 30% is actually edible at the time of being tossed. And if you have looked into recent numbers on the referrals to food banks in Canada, you will see that there could be definitely much better uses of the food that is actually being tossed. So better operations, decreasing the waste in the first place, and better operations can help quite a bit to bring down these numbers to acceptable levels. Now, the focus that I have in this particular piece is on traceability. So traceability is something that has been touted as a key to bring down the food waste. In here I have some quotes. So for example, this one from World Economic Forum that says real-time tracking supports sustainability, prevents food waste, and ensures compliance with environmental standards. Or this one from Forbes, blockchain transparency could force food suppliers to eliminate inefficiencies in the supply chain, so reducing waste. And of course, we have regulations such as EU transparency regulation, and so on and so forth. Now, so the idea is in here, traceability, intuitively speaking, should be leading to food waste. If we know what is going on in the supply chain, if we know the conditions under which food is being treated, processed, and transported, then hopefully we can use this information in order to bring down food waste. That's the key intuition behind all these initiatives. We do have companies out there that are investing in this technology, trying to see how they can track food along the supply chain better and help retailers, suppliers, food processors, and farmers to bring down food waste. But the question that I'm asking in this, we are asking together with two colleagues in this research, is whether traceability actually is conducive to a reduction in food waste. And of course, the key angle that we have to answer the question is we do have different players in the supply chain. So we have a supplier, we have a retailer, we have consumers, and they have different incentives in buying, distributing, and consuming food. So when you bring in those incentives, traceability, although could be good in case we had a social planner planning for the entire supply chain, but when it comes to the actual players, that traceability may not happen or may not lead to lower food waste in the supply chain. That's the key idea that we have in the paper. And the idea that we have in here is that we cannot also take a look at traceability as a 0-1 variable. Either there is no traceability or there is full traceability. It could be the case that some level of traceability could be implemented in the supply chain that can align the incentives of all the players in order to bring down the food waste. So this is basically what we are trying to say. So traceability blankly cannot be good for reduction of the food waste because it doesn't align the incentives in the supply chain. Some part of it, a level of it, could be indeed implemented and could be good in order to bring down the food waste. So not all the way to 0, not all the way to 1, but somewhere in between could be the one that aligns the incentives. So that's the key point in here. Let's not, I'm not going to spend time on the literature, but as I mentioned before, there is quite a bit of interest in agricultural supply chains in OMOR literature, and in particular recently in the food waste problem. So we can see a lot of interesting papers that are coming up recently on how to control food waste in different stages of the supply chain. Of course, food loss itself, as I mentioned at the beginning, is also a very interesting problem. And we do have researchers that are working on the problem of food loss as well. So an example out of my own curiosity is optimizing cleaning operations. So farmers do not have the technology, for example, to pick up all the harvest from the farmland. And it's not really economical for them to go and make the harvest 100%. So whatever remains on the farm, usually they don't do anything about it. It remains there to rot. But then if you can design and implement a cleaning operation, you can actually have that remainder harvested and then distributed to people who need it. So this is what we mean by cleaning operations. It minimizes food loss. This is, of course, food loss, and minimizing the harvest loss because of those would be a very interesting problem. And we do have some papers on that one as well. But I'm not going to get into the details of this in the interest of time. Now, for me, this is the key stage and basically what I will be basing the discussion on. The way we thought about this problem is the following. So we said we have a supply chain, a downstream part of the supply chain. So it's not the processors or farmers. We are focusing about the wholesalers. So we have a supplier in here. we have a retailer, and we have the consumers at the very end of the supply chain. So we have three players in this setup. So the supplier puts an order to a wholesaler or perhaps a distributor in order to get supplies into its warehouse. So that's the I coming in. So part of this inventory goes to what we call spoilage. So why is it that I am focusing on spoilage out of all different kinds of food waste? The reason is 60% of food waste, not the food loss, that's a different problem. Food waste, 60% of it, according to some estimates, is because of spoilage. So to me, focusing on this large fraction was the interesting part. That's why we focus on the spoilage part. And the way I modeled it is a proportional yield loss. So you have I available, so you're buying I, but you will be losing 1 minus theta of it due to spoilage. It could be because of bad packaging, it could be because of temperature changes, trucks that are not refrigerated, and so on and so forth. So you're losing a proportion of that yield to spoilage. And then you will be shipping the remainder of it to a retailer. Retailer is going to do the sales, of course, first. So the consumers at the end of it are going to receive the product from the retailer. And then with the remainder of it, part of it can go to clearance. So this could be discounted products. And the remainder is going to go to waste. Now, in here, I don't show it, but we also include the consumer's side in the revision of the paper, as we got some complaints from the reviewers. We have also included the consumer side. So consumers are also freshness sensitive. So when you go to a shop, you usually, given two apples, you go for the one that is shinier, that is better, it's kind of looking better. So consumer waste can also happen, and it depends on the freshness as well. So we also include that one in the model in order to see what the implication of different policy would be on the overall waste in this supply chain. So that's the key part of the paper. That's basically the heart of the model. And then the rest of it basically is the details on how we went about modeling freshness in the supply chain and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to focus on these. I would like to kind of highlight the one aspect that I briefly mentioned before, the traceability idea. So as I mentioned, on the left-hand side, we have the extreme traceability, which is equal to 0. So there is no information shared up and down the supply chain. So that's basically one extreme. And the other extreme would be that supplier and the retailer are sharing everything about the product. So the retailer knows exactly the level of the freshness of the product that is being shipped from the supplier to the retailer, and also the processes that the supplier is using. So I translate that knowledge into the knowledge about this P. So if I get back to this model over here, so maybe one more. So you see the freshness has two levels in this model. It's going to be high freshness with probability P. It's going to be low freshness, probability 1 minus P. So I translate full traceability to the retailer, not only knowing what theta is, but also knowing what P is. So if the retailer knows P, then they can invest in improving that process. Improving means I'm going to be increasing the fraction of batches with high freshness. If I don't know, I cannot do that. So that's full traceability information. I know process and product information. So this is full traceability. And of course, we also have, as I mentioned, no traceability, but in between, we also have a level of information sharing. So I can let you know what theta is, the level of freshness. I'm going to tell you how the product is. I'm not going to tell you what's going on in my processes. You cannot basically have a window to my processes. But I'm going to let you know what the freshness level of the product is. So we can have 0, we can have all the way, or we can have something in between. And the key learning in this paper would be that, of course, very little is not going to lead to reduction in food waste all the way through. Unfortunately, it's great, but the point is there are no incentives, but you can also do something in between in order to align the incentives. Now, so again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to focus on the details, but if I compare basically information asymmetry, so when the supplier doesn't know anything, versus when the the spoilage information is being shared, one thing that we identify is the over-ordering effect. So if the retailer gets to know the freshness level before ordering from the supplier, then it's not good enough, in the sense that the retailer, knowing the freshness level, increases the order levels. So if you increase the order levels, the implication would be you will have more waste because we have proportional waste in the supply chain. So a little bit of information being shared in here, only on the product, is going to lead to over-ordering rather than reducing the waste in the supply chain. Now, if we go all the way and we share the process and product information with the retailer, then the retailer will have the incentives to invest in suppliers' processes and improve P. So this is what we call process improvement effect, which is great because the fraction of shipments with higher quality is going to go up, but the impact on the overall waste is not clear-cut, because better batches means higher ordering quantities, and higher ordering quantities could mean more waste. So whether we can design policies to align the incentives here is the key question. And now, without getting into too much detailing here, we show that if the cost of improving the processes is low enough, then the incentives will be aligned to improve the processes and reduce the food waste. So the cost of improving the process should be low enough. The cost of traceability should be low enough in order for food waste to come down in the supply chain. And that usually translates into providing subsidies to implement traceability in the supply chain. If traceability is expensive, then the implementation of it is not going to help bring down the food waste. Now, so in terms of the key findings, that's basically how much I wanted to say. In terms of key findings, well, supply chain information, we completely got out of it. It doesn't matter, I was almost done. So information sharing is not necessarily equivalent to reducing waste in the supply chain. And in some circumstances, waste penalties can help bring down the food waste, but the more effective way will be to implement some level of traceability in the supply chain, and if necessary, providing subsidies to make it incentive compatible. Otherwise, traceability can actually lead to increase in food waste. So those are the key points I wanted to make in the second one as well. And with that, I am right on time. Kudos. But I'm happy to take questions as if you have any. Thanks a lot.